Okay, everyone. Happy Friday. It's a couple minutes after. I'm sure we'll have some more folks joining us in the next few minutes, but got a good batch here today. Welcome to our ongoing series of calls, giving you business leaders a sense of what's going to be happening in Salem. Every year we do this, and keeping you posted on critical climate policies. My name is Tim Miller. I'm the director of Oregon Business for Climate. We are a league of about 100 participating companies employing 30,000 Oregonians all across the state. And we see addressing climate change as obviously an imperative for our communities, but also an opportunity for our businesses throughout the state. And we're really pleased to be co-hosting today's briefing with Oregon Environmental Council and my colleague and friend, Nora Apter, the Climate Program Director at OEC. Nora, you want to say a couple words about OEC?
Sure. Thanks, Tim. And thank you all again for joining us. We're so happy to be able to have the chance to have this conversation. Again, I'm Nora Apter with the Oregon Environmental Council. For folks who aren't familiar with OEC, we are a statewide environmental policy nonprofit. We've worked in Oregon for over 50 years to advance innovative and collaborative solutions to protect Oregon's environment and safeguard our communities and economy. Thanks, Tim. I'll hand it back to you.
You bet. Thanks, Nora. We're also honored to be joined by Representative Janelle Bynum and Representative Pam Marsh, both leaders on advancing climate policies in Salem, and we'll be formally introducing those two leaders later in the call. Also, if you all could please introduce yourselves in the chat, just put your name and your affiliation and your pronouns, if you'd like, in the chat, just so we can all see who's here. Let me go ahead and move forward to. I really want to thank our partners in bringing several of you to this call, B Local PDX and the Zero Coalition and the Oregon Solar and Storage Industries Association. Thank you all for being here and for bringing your members to this conversation. Let me just quickly breeze over the agenda for you all. You all know that business leaders are critical to advancing climate policies in Oregon. It's a unique voice to bring because so often legislators hear from folks in the business community who don't necessarily see the urgency of advancing climate policy. So your voices are critical. To help empower your voices, what we're going to do today is give you a little bit of background on the policy landscape that we have as a backdrop for this year's policies. And then we'll get into a legislative session preview, talking about some of the climate priorities that we see this year. And then we'll also have time for a Q&A. And once we get into Q&A, or actually throughout the call, feel free to use the Q&A function here in Zoom to drop your questions, and then we'll get to as many questions as we can. Okay, let's go ahead and jump in. Again, the climate policy backdrop is just sort of in terms of policies over the last few years. We have clean transportation rules, we have the advanced clean cars rules, advanced clean truck rules, other things around transportation. We've made a lot of progress there. We also have 100% clean electricity for all. This is the policy that is working with our electricity providers, our IOUs, to get to 100% clean energy by 2040. The three other backdrop things we're going to talk about today are the Federal Inflation Reduction Act, huge sums of money and opportunity that I'll talk about. Then we'll talk about the Climate Resilience Package, which we passed last year, and that's an important piece as we head into this year. And then finally, the Climate Protection Program and the status of that, and that's being challenged, and we'll talk about that. So these are the backdrop things we're going to cover. So turning to IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, huge, historic, unprecedented. These are the words that we've been using about this giant advancement in funding and climate policy for over a year now. Credit Suisse said it'll have a profound effect across industries and really has a potential to shape the direction of the American economy. Pretty strong words. Just to put that in terms of Oregon's economy, and I know I'm going fast, feel free to put questions again in the Q&A function, but we got a lot to cover. In terms of Oregon's opportunity, so the initial estimate on IRA was that it would bring or invest about $370 billion. That's in equitable climate investments. If you just do the simple math, that means Oregon's share would be about $4.7 billion. Now, if you look harder at that, the Rocky Mountain Institute did, they said actually Oregon stands to land about $8 billion. So these are big opportunities that if we do it right and make the investments needed and have everyone aware of this, we could generate $8 billion, or sorry, draw down $8 billion of support to make progress. This touches nearly every industry in Oregon, and we get thousands of local jobs and cleaner air and energy cost savings. And there's also the Justice 40 provision that cuts across the Inflation Reduction Act to drive 40% of those benefits going into our disadvantaged communities as defined in the IRA. Now, those are big numbers, but let's look at an even bigger number. Goldman Sachs looked at the Inflation Reduction Act and said, well, actually, given that a lot of it is on tax incentives, so the more aware we are and the more we invest and the more active we are, we can generate more for our economy. That across the country, it could have $1.2 trillion of incentives, spurring $2.9 trillion of total investment when you add the private sector with the public sector. Oregon's share of that would be $37 billion. That's over 10 years, $3.7 billion a year. Again, main message here is pay attention to the Inflation Reduction Act whenever you can. It touches everything. To secure that money, we're going to need strong state implementation and strong private investment. When I say it touches just about every industry, that's agriculture, that's manufacturing, that's contractors, that's automotive, that's folks working with our utilities, folks working in disadvantaged communities, really any business in rural Oregon, because there are rural components of this, working with labs and research, software for any of the above kind of companies. Really, if you're a business serving any of these, or this is how I catch everybody else, if you're a business with a fleet, or if you're a business with or in buildings, you are touched by the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's how we can say it touches pretty much every sector. All right. Let's see, Nora, can I turn this over to you?
Sure, thanks, Tim. So again, the Inflation Reduction Act, along with other recently passed congressional investments, provides an enormous opportunity for Oregon sector-wide. And recognizing this opportunity, the 2023 legislature made some important progress to ensure that Oregon meets this moment, does not leave dollars on the table, and does whatever we can to leverage these investments and translate this funding into meaningful on-the-ground benefits for Oregon's communities and economies. Folks who were tracking last year's session probably remember it was marred by a historic walkout and really marred by that Republican-led protest that unfortunately halted work on hundreds of bills for 6 weeks. I say that because it really underscores just how significant it is that the 2023 climate package was signed into law. So that walkout ended, with 2 weeks remaining until sine die, the constitutional end of session, hundreds of bills and budgets awaiting final passage. And thanks to the dedicated leadership of our legislative champions and advocates, the legislature prioritized and passed this sweeping climate package in those final frantic days of session. So the 2023 climate package pulled together 20 different policies from the 2023 session that will cut climate pollution and increase protection for our communities and economies. These policies focus on driving down emissions from our homes and buildings, increasing carbon sequestration on our natural and working lands, accelerating the development of renewable energy, and again, improving community resilience in the face of ever worsening climate impacts. As I mentioned, these policies were strategically crafted to leverage the unprecedented federal investments from the Inflation Reduction Act. So by investing about $90 million total across these 20 different policies, we've estimated this package could enable the state to leverage at least 10 times that, so $1 billion in federal funding for climate and clean energy. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of the policies included in the package. We won't have time to go through all of these today, but want to just encapsulate how impressive and important this package is. Next slide. So again, especially given the unprecedented political hurdles and just overall tumultuousness of the 2023 session, the climate resilience package is really a remarkable victory, and it would not have been possible without our dedicated leaders in the legislature, including Rep. Marsh, who we're excited to hear from later today, but also not without the advocacy of a really broad coalition of climate and environmental justice, labor, youth, and other partners across the state. But I especially want to applaud and call out engagement from the business community, which was absolutely essential to getting this package across the finish line, and countering some 11th hour opposition to these policies, despite many months of process and engagement. So just want to really thank those in the business community who stepped up, provided the support, and helped get these policies across the finish line. We're just so thrilled that our state leaders are stepping up to meet the moment on federal funding. And as we'll hear later, there is more work to do, especially given, as Tim said, we could leverage upwards of $8 billion, if not tens of billions of dollars, just from the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's more work to do, and the 2024 session is another important opportunity to build on this progress and ensure that we are best positioned to leverage and implement the federal funding opportunity. So Tim, welcome you to add anything there, but I'll hand it back to you.
Great. No, thanks, Nora. That's awesome. I'm going to touch now on the third piece of backdrop, and then we'll get into the ledge preview. So the last piece of backdrop here again is the climate protection program. This chart here is showing you the top line would be projected increases of emissions over time if business as usual continued. HB 2021 is the bill I told you about that is requiring our IOU electricity providers to reduce their emissions. It makes a huge wedge there. But that big green wedge is the climate protection plan, climate protection program, either way. This sets a cap on emissions from our natural gas providers and some of our liquid fuel providers, and requires them to reduce their emissions over time, 90% down by 2050. It's the other huge wedge in this chart. Unfortunately, that program was challenged by industry groups, fossil fuel providers, and groups that are aligned with their view. And the Court of Appeals recently said, based on a procedural technicality, the climate protection plan is not valid. That official ruling is going to come out next week, but the statement came out already. Without the climate protection plan, you saw those wedges. Without that, we don't have a plan to reduce our emissions as much as we need to meet Oregon's climate goals, let alone the real climate goals that we need to be achieving. So we need strong and swift state action to get this program back in place. I would say, unfortunately, while we're doing this, we also have a backdrop of an information effort by some of our largest fossil fuel providers. And unfortunately, that information is inaccurate, to be polite. And that information is going to businesses and legislators throughout the state. So those information efforts are having an impact, setting a negative backdrop for this critical program. So we need your support. How can businesses help? Well, first of all, whenever you hear information about the climate protection plan, consider the source of that information and what their incentives are. And then voice support for urgent action to get this program back in place. That's with the DEQ and the Environmental Quality Commission, who looks over the DEQ. Again, business voices are critical and unique and bring a strong element to policymakers, whether it's in the commission or DEQ staff or whoever. Bring your voices. This lawsuit and the information campaign I mentioned are just two tactics. We're going to see more tactics over time. This is going to be a long haul to get this fixed, but it also needs to be fixed urgently. If you're ready to engage right now, there's an EQC hearing on Wednesday next week, starting at 1:30. Just pick up the phone and tell them it's important to address climate change. That's simple. Okay, let's get into our legislative preview now, and we're a little bit ahead of schedule, so we're doing fine. Thanks so much, Nora. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Tim. So before I turn it over to Rep Marsh and Rep Bynum, I want to just provide a little bit of context around what to expect in the short session. If you could go to the next slide, Tim. Great. So I'll be introducing Rep Marsh and Rep Bynum in just a moment here. But before I do, sorry, if you could go to the one more slide, Tim, just going to share a little bit in terms of what to expect. So as the name suggests, the short session is quite short. It's 35 days. Tim, sorry, one more slide. Okay, great. Thank you. 35 days, which is not a ton of time to pass major policy initiatives. They're typically focused on unfinished policy business from the previous session, updating budgets, considering nominees for state and board commission seats, but with pressing issues like housing access, drug addiction, and education affecting the state, the governor and legislative leaders have identified a pretty ambitious agenda. At the same time, we have an election coming up later this year, so we're in the midst of some consequential shifts in the legislative makeup. So for instance, House Speaker Dan Rayfield is running for Attorney General. The House is expected to vote this Monday to elect a new speaker. That's just one of a number of shifts that will be hanging in the background during the short session. At the same time, we all recognize that we cannot lose sight of the ongoing climate crisis, which has implications for the state's ability to address economic development and growth, public health, all housing access and affordability. We're in the decisive decade for climate action, so the legislature cannot afford to take a year off climate action. So with that, we are excited to hear from Rep Bynum and Rep Marsh about what they are excited to be leading on in the climate and clean energy space this session. Next slide, please. I'm now honored to introduce Oregon State Representative Janelle Bynum. Rep Bynum has been such an important leader in the legislature, supporting economic development and job growth. She's spearheaded bipartisan initiatives encompassing voter engagement and turnout, investment in K-12 and higher education, targeted support for underrepresented businesses, and so much more. She's currently serving her fourth term as representative for House District 39, which includes Happy Valley and North Clackamas, and she serves as chair of the House Committee on Small Business and Economic Development. We're thrilled that Rep Bynum is championing important legislation this session to help expand and grow Oregon's clean energy economy. With that, I will turn it over to Rep Bynum. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Nora. It's an exciting time to be able to talk about clean technology and leadership. What Nora didn't mention was that I'm an electrical engineer by training, and I'm also a mom of 4. And I come to this work primarily as a love letter to Oregon's children. I see the work in this space as protecting our children's health and protecting our children's future. And I have kids with asthma, and I can recall when the wildfires came through and came close to our house a few years ago. I just remember having to pack up our home, well, the things that we could carry onto a plane, and it being a real experience for all of us. And my oldest daughter, I remember she was like, okay, I packed up the pictures and all our awards, And then I packed a dress in case we end up in the South and we have to go to church. And I'll never forget that experience because just having to flee because my children could not breathe was transformative for my husband and me. So thank you for inviting me today. I'm excited to be here. I am the chief sponsor of House Bill 3579. And over the summer, I had the pleasure of speaking at a Portland startup event with Senator Wyden and State Treasurer Tobias Reed. And it was really at this meeting that I was talking with a local business owner that I first heard about the clean tech leadership concept. And I was really interested because the vision for the bill was similar to what we had accomplished in the semiconductor sector last year. So I was like, oh, okay, we can build on the work that we did growing the semiconductor industry with I think we did like $250 to $300 million investment. And that led to what is projected to be $43 billion in Oregon economic activity, as well as 6,000 jobs. So I think there's a really strong linkage here. And so over the last several months, my office has been working with the Oregon Environmental Council and other advocates to reintroduce the concept this session. And it's really been a pleasure working with them. And my heart is in economic development, again, in service to Oregon's children, because I want to make sure that when they graduate high school or even when they're in high school, they have the opportunity to explore the world around them and they have an opportunity to change the world around them. So this is just one option for them. And I think that the options are what are important. So now turning to the bill, we introduced it as House Bill 4112, and it looks to accomplish a few things. So it has passed the Oregon Department of Administrative Services with conducting the rulemaking to incentivize procurement of renewable energy. And then it would also create the Oregon Clean Energy Technology Manufacturing Opportunity Fund, which will provide grants and low interest loans to organizations for the purposes of increasing clean tech manufacturing operations in Oregon. And again, it's investing in Oregon's children and it's investing in Oregon's economy. And then it'll also establish a Clean Technology Leadership Advisory Council to provide recommendations so that Oregon can continue its growth in the clean tech sector and best position our state to attract federal investment dollars. One of the things that we learned in doing the semiconductor bill was that we had to shift our mindset a little bit and say that we were competing on a global scale in a global marketplace. We were not just competing with, Oregonians versus Oregonians. We were competing on an international scale. And Oregon can be and should be an international player in something that is so beloved and so much a part of the DNA of Oregonians. We love the land, we love clean water, we love the air. And that is not, in my opinion, a partisan issue. We all value the land, the air, the water, and that is something that makes Oregon unique. So I will close with saying that the procurement piece is really timely, and we've seen a disparity study done by DAS. And so we always want to make sure that whatever legislation that we pass, it is fair, it is equitable, it makes sure that a multitude of voices and a multitude of participants are included in the process. And so I want to make sure that not only does this benefit, families and businesses in Portland, but it also has a statewide impact. It also goes from, high school all the way up to PhD levels in terms of investments and the things that we're trying to do in our state. So with that, I think I'll close there. We have a variety of things that we can put forth, that we can grow with this bill. I really believe that we can fund innovation in this state, and we can value innovation. We can also value performance and outcomes. And that is the most important thing. If we are not driving outcomes, then we haven't done anything. And it's just, it's just hocus pocus. But we can create some of the most fantastic innovations in our state, especially partnering with our universities and our business industries. And we can save the planet for our children for thousands of years to come. So thank you for allowing me to speak today.
Thank you so much for being here at Bynum, and again, for your leadership on this really exciting and important legislation. As you noted, this is such a huge opportunity for Oregon, for our economy, for jobs, and again, for making sure that we have these life-saving technologies that we're going to need for our clean energy future. So thank you so much for championing this legislation. We're so excited to work to get it across the finish line this session. So with that, I'm now honored to introduce Rep. Pam Marsh, who has been a vital champion for climate progress in the legislature. Rep. Marsh is serving her 4th term as state representative for House District 5, which spans southern Jackson County from the Green Springs to the Applegate. She currently serves as chair of the House Committee on Climate, Energy, and Environment, where she has shepherded vital policy progress to promote energy efficiency and affordability, to promote environmental justice, to advance wildfire mitigation efforts. Rep. Marsh was at the forefront of the state's successful effort to adopt our 100% clean electricity law, and was absolutely instrumental in passing last year's climate package. Simply put, we would not be celebrating the climate and clean energy progress from the past few years without the leadership of Rep. Marsh. Rep. Marsh is going to speak to a few different policy initiatives this session focused on offshore wind, energy storage and siting, as well as the governor's housing package. So with that, I will hand it over to Rep. Marsh. Thank you.
Nora, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for being here on this Friday. It's really a treat to get to be on a panel with Rep. Bynum. We were elected in the same year. 2016 was our initial elections. And we don't usually get to be in the same room because we really do complementary work. I really depend on all of her expertise around economic development, semiconductors, justice issues that she's been heavily involved in. So it's fun to be able to be together here today. As Nora noted, the session that's coming up is a very abbreviated session. We have a number of big items that are going to be on the agenda, primarily housing and issues around addiction and behavioral health. Our climate issues are not likely to be in the spotlight, but it is an opportunity for us to do some good basic work that are really sort of the fundamentals of bigger policy that may come in the future. So we're just going to talk briefly here this morning about what some of those are expected to be. The first one, as Nora noted, is relates to offshore wind. So our bills right now have preliminary numbers. LC really is legislative concept. By now, the bills have been filed, and you'll very soon start hearing bill numbers that sound more familiar, like a House bill or a Senate bill. This bill is a House bill. The primary author is Representative Graber. I'm also on the bill, as are a number of other people. And this is work that she's collaborated on with unions and with the governor's office. The offshore wind bill will do 2 significant things. First, it will address labor standards. If the state does move forward with offshore wind, and many of us are certainly hoping that that winds up being a complement to our clean energy options, we want to make sure that workers are well taken care of. So there will be worker standards that are very similar to what the feds are already requiring in offshore wind, and that are reflective of the work that we did in House Bill 2021, which, as you've heard, was the 100% clean electricity bill. The second thing that we'll see in the offshore wind bill is development of what we're calling a roadmap. If you're reading the headlines, you know that offshore wind has not been without controversy on the coast. There are lots of stakeholders who are looking, some in a very excited way and some in a very skeptical way about the development of this technology. There's concerns about what it might mean for the fishing industry. There's questions about what it means for communities. There's issues around how the power that's generated in offshore wind would be transmitted to places where it's used. So the roadmap process will continue some very successful conversations that are underway right now. The governor's office has been a great partner in that, bringing together a variety of stakeholders and taking the conversation one step at a time to see if we can develop a local consensus and see if we can build in any proposal for offshore wind, things like labor standards or community benefits. There is some urgency to this. The Biden administration is hoping to move forward with contracts later in 2024. So the roadmap is really a critical step to seeing if we can develop a consensus around the adoption of the technology. So that's the offshore wind bill. And who's over? I don't know who's working the slides, but thank you. The second bill we're going to talk about is around the siting of independent storage facilities. You all know, if you're watching wind and solar and renewable development, that we're starting to hear more and more talk about the location of batteries along with those renewable projects. It already exists in some places. PGE is being pretty aggressive and starting to look at batteries and to actually implement them in sites. We believe over time we will see cases in which battery storage is located independently of generation facilities. Right now, you're mostly seeing batteries accompany solar, accompany wind, so that you have one integrated site. But we want to be prepared when batteries proposals start coming forward to simply locate batteries independently. So we have a bill that just takes some first initial steps toward making sure that we have the process in place that will allow us to do that. This bill, and it'll be a House bill. It is a committee bill for my committee, which is the Climate, Energy, and Environment Committee. So our committee is sponsoring this legislation. We'll do a few things. First, it will define what we're talking about when we talk about energy storage. It's important to have that definition in statute. Secondly, it will clarify that if a storage facility is located in tandem with a generation facility, that there's not a need for an independent siting process to be executed. And third, it will clarify that if a local renewable developer or a local county wishes for that project to be evaluated at the state level by FSEC, which is our siting agency, that instead of the project going through the county siting authority, that it can be shifted to go through the state siting facility. Now, there are many more issues that we need to take on in regard to independent storage siting. Specifically, we made an attempt to see if we could get some agreement around how these facilities should be considered when they are proposed to be assigned to farmland. We weren't able to get agreement on that, so we left that piece of the bill aside. And what we've got here is an important building block of the conversations that will come in the future. So that's energy storage siting. And then I get the privilege of talking about the governor's housing production package. So as you've heard, housing is going to be one of the two big issues that we'll be talking about. The governor, who's been laser focused on the production of housing and the address the issues around homelessness, has come forward with a bill that's about a $500 million bill. This is a bill that's been in the works really since the very end of the long session. We did important work in the long session, but we didn't solve our housing problems. And the governor's team started working the day after that session ended to come back with the package that you will see in front. You can see this. We now know the Senate bill number for this package, which makes this more useful. That's going to be Senate Bill 1537. And the package does a number of things. First, it will establish a housing production office in the governor's office. This is a place where we will have the capacity under the governor to really oversee housing production on multiple different levels. I think it's a really important step forward, and we need a centerpiece for this work. So that's what the housing production office will provide. The bill also addresses conditions under which certain design requirements at the local level should be bypassed for residential projects. The bill addresses limited conditions in which housing production should be allowed to take place outside the urban growth boundary. For those of you who are alarmed when you hear that, I will say from my perspective, what's in the bill is very limited. It allows cities over 25,000 in population to annex up to 150 acres. Cities below 25,000 are limited to 75 acres. This can only be executed if a city meets certain conditions. A couple of those are aimed at the use of land that's already within the UGB. City has to demonstrate that land has been used up or is ready to be used for some function. The city also has to demonstrate that their community has a disproportionate impact of renters who are paying above 50% of their income, disproportionate costs of housing for its residents. So in order to pursue the UGB option, you'll have to show both that your land is being used up, and secondly, that your community of low income or very low income residents really needs housing. The other items that are in the bill, the 500 million, goes for a couple of specific housing projects, largely. 200 million is dedicated to the development of infrastructure. Another 200 million is dedicated to a revolving loan fund that will help us invest in middle income housing. That is housing that serves people from 80 to 120% of median income. We understand more and more that it's really critical for the public sector to get involved in helping private developers with their projects serving middle income housing, because the cost of developing that housing, land costs, building costs, simply outstrip what people in those designated income brackets can pay. So some very targeted, very focused investments from the state can help get units on the ground that wouldn't otherwise be there, can ensure that we have workers who are ready to serve, and that we have and that families have a place to live. So it's a big housing package. And from an environmental point of view, there's a exciting, it's not the biggest part of the package, but an exciting little piece in there, which is acknowledging that as we build new housing, we want to make sure that it's energy efficient and that it really meets our expectations around environmental impact. So $20 million of the package will be dedicated to grant incentives for new affordable housing to allow them to really invest in electrification of systems and appliances as those projects are built. So that's the big housing production package. I think when you look at it, it is my view that clearly we need to build a lot of housing. This package aims to get units on the ground, and I think it aims to do so in ways that are cognizant of and sensitive to appropriate environmental considerations. So Nora, I think those are my slides.
Yes, thank you so much, Rep. Marsh. Really appreciate those updates and very excited to see all of this hopefully move forward in just a few weeks. So before we turn to Q&A, which as a reminder, please feel free to add any questions as they come to you in the chat. We'll get to the Q&A discussion shortly, but first want to wrap up with a couple final priorities for the 2024 short session. So first, again, short session, we have a lot of focus on unfinished policy business, updating budgets. In addition to the policy priorities that Rep. Bynum and Rep. Marsh shared, we're also really eager to see the legislature adopt a strong climate budget. This is really an important opportunity to help make sure that we're staying on track to achieve our climate and community benefit goals. As we've talked about, Oregon has made some really important progress in adopting important programs and policies the past few years, but we need to sustain funding for those programs in order to ensure continued momentum and success. So this year, we are really eager to ensure that a few key existing programs that are focused on improving health and energy affordability and supporting emissions reductions get the funding that they need to meet the popularity and demand of the programs. So the first piece of the climate budget that we're really excited about is a request to fund Oregon's Healthy Homes program. This is a program that was set up a couple years ago and is really focused on supporting the long-term well-being of low-income Oregonians by supporting home upgrades that lower energy bills, improve indoor air quality, and create homes that are resilient to the climate extremes that are unfortunately impacting us more and more frequently. So the Healthy Homes program is expected to very quickly run through its initial budget of $15 million. And so it's really important that we make sure it is funded now so it can continue serving the community until the next budget cycle. So providing $15 million this session will help address gaps left by state and federal energy efficiency and weatherization funding. It can also be braided together to help pay for home repairs that will cut climate pollution, improve health, and again, lower energy bills. Another key piece of the climate budget that we are excited to see move forward is funding for the Oregon Clean Vehicle Rebate Program, and specifically the Charge Ahead Rebate Program. This is a really key grant program that supports low and moderate income Oregonians and helping to be able to afford electric vehicles, either new or used EVs. There has been so much demand for this program, and without additional funding this session, it's likely to be suspended pretty early this year, essentially run out of funding. So we're really eager for the legislature to allocate $20 million to the Charge Ahead Rebate Program to make sure that low and moderate income Oregonians can afford their next car, whether it's new or used, to be electric. And then finally, very eager to see additional funding for the Worker Climate Fund. Oregon OSHA in the past couple of years has made really important progress to protect workers who are on the front lines of climate impacts like wildfire smoke and extreme heat, to make sure that common sense protections are in place when the AQI reaches levels that are unhealthy or temperatures reach such extremes that workers, really should not be forced to be outside or forced to choose between their health and their paycheck. But there are times when, like, the AQI gets to be over 500, temperatures are truly too unsafe to be outside, when farm workers and others are forced to choose between their health and their paycheck. And we want to make sure that that does not happen. So the Worker Climate Fund provides compensation for workers who lose those days of work due to climate extremes. So the request is for $9 million for that fund. And again, will make a really important difference in making sure that we are prioritizing the health and well-being of workers on the front lines of climate impacts. Next slide.
While we're on this slide, Nora,
sure.
I just wanted to add one other thing. As you mentioned, part of this effort is to be sure we have a strong climate budget every year, and that becomes part of the program, keeping our existing programs well funded. One of those other programs that needs funding is our solar rebates, and there's going to be an ask for $10 million of funding for solar rebates. So many of those touch, of course, many of us, whether we're homeowners or commercial, have a commercial building or in a commercial building. So installations of solar, wanted to be sure that was mentioned as well.
Thank you so much, Tim. So happy that you mentioned that. Absolutely. I should note, this is not by any means a comprehensive list. There are so many important programs that we want to see funded, but wanted to call out just a few. So thank you so much. I appreciate that. I know we're getting close on time, so I'm just going to quickly run through this last but not least priority, which is a concept led by Senator Dembro to update our state greenhouse gas reduction targets. We all know that without immediate and aggressive climate government action to reduce emissions, that unfortunately temperatures are likely to surpass the dangerous threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming within the next decade. But despite this broad scientific consensus, Oregon hasn't updated its climate goals in 15 years. So this policy is really just focused on getting us up to speed with the best available science, as well as other states and the federal government's targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it updates our statewide greenhouse gas reduction targets to make sure we have a North Star that is aligned with what the science says is necessary to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. It also establishes a first ever target for Oregon to achieve net zero emissions. So leveraging both emissions reductions, but also sequestration on natural working lands, hopefully to achieve net zero by no later than 2050. Next slide, please. All right, we're not going to spend much time on this today, but again, with a short session, while we're eager to see the policies and climate budget pass this session, in the background, there will also be conversations ongoing in preparation for some larger policy initiatives in 2025. Among those conversations, we know there will continue to be efforts and interest in identifying policy and funding needs related to clean electricity, conversations around regional transmission organization and transmission investments, as well as preparation for what we expect will be a pretty major transportation omnibus package in 2025. So I'll leave that there. We have plenty of time to come back to these and other topics after the short session, but I will now turn it back to you, Tim, and we'll kick off our Q&A shortly.
Great. And there's some great questions in chat. Thank you all for putting those in there. Just wanted to say here for you business leaders, again, the business perspective is powerful. I'm sure Rep Bynum and Rep Marsh can speak to that it's always helpful to have a business person bring their real perspective to the table. And if you're interested in weighing in, please just type yes in the chat and we'll make sure that we get your name on the list to engage with you or keep you posted on specific bills. And if you have a particular interest area, just say yes and especially blank. Let us know that. We're not going to fill your inbox. We totally get that you're busy. If you're not available when we reach out and say, hey, can you join a hearing next Thursday? If you're not available, we totally get it. Also, if you're watching this on a recording, just send us an email. You'll see our email addresses in the last slide. So that's engagement. So let's get to the Q&A, and we have a bunch. So let's scroll up here. There was one about development and the fact that trees are cut down to that have impacts. And I wonder if anybody has a comment. Nora, maybe you do, or Rep Bynum or Rep Marsh, about whether the housing bill has anything regarding that.
This is Pam. I'm happy to chime in on that. You probably saw headlines that were sparked a lot of concern when the governor, who has a current housing advisory board, suggested that tree standards should be relaxed in order to develop more housing. That is not a part of the governor's package. She didn't indicate, frankly, any interest in really embracing that approach. And so it's, while tree rules are still going to be subject to local regulations if they exist, that we are not, I think, in any way putting forward policy that will result in a disproportionate loss of trees.
Got it. And while you're on the topic, Rep Marsh, there was also a question about whether there's an emphasis on keeping transportation to a minimum as we develop more housing.
But all of it, yeah, thank you. All of the housing package is being developed in the context of our climate friendly communities program. You may remember that Governor Brown, as part of her executive order, when Cap and Invest failed a couple of times, and she segued to an executive order, required the Department of Land Conservation and Development to set out a climate framework that should be adopted by local communities that really emphasizes a denser approach to development, de-emphasizes parking. It's frankly been controversial within cities who feel like they're being asked to do a lot in a short time period, but we're still moving forward on that front. So that's the framework that exists as we move forward on efforts to really try to spur our housing development.
Great, thank you. It looks like some of the micro mobility questions were addressed in chat. I'm going to turn to Bill's question about EV incentives. A concern that when we add on an EV incentive, does the price just go up at the dealership, particularly in the charge ahead rebates? Is there anything in that legislation that kind of looks at that or keeps track of being sure we're not just passing through incentives to the folks who are selling the cars? Are we making the cars more available? Anybody have a data on that?
Marsh, I wasn't sure if you were, I'm happy to.
Sure. Nora, this is a hard one. I'm going to let you answer.
It is a hard one. So this is again an existing program. I think that in general, there's a lot of work to do, especially with the federal incentives coming down to make sure that these types of rebates are being adequately implemented. I have not, the charge ahead program itself, to my understanding, doesn't specifically call out the dealer harvest of all the value phenomenon, but it is something I think that we can definitely be thinking about if there are tweaks to the program, in addition to just making sure it's able to stay open. I will say, I think given the demand that we hear from consumers, that it is, in general, having its intended impact in terms of benefiting and driving down costs. But it is a good thing to keep in mind. And as Rep Marsh said, also not the easiest to answer.
If I
Another
can
one
make a
is,
quick comment,
oh yeah, please.
just kind of overlaying the whole conversation about how we become more climate resilient. Having experienced this, I don't know, nice storm, snow and ice, I think it's really important for us to be ambitious, to be to push the boundaries, but to also understand when you can get backlash and how that can harm your ability to move forward. And so as we, there are pictures of Teslas parked near charging stations that couldn't move, right? And so we know, and I think this is why I'm such a hawk on doing the innovation part and really investing in the innovation, because when people are inconvenienced, even in a small way, but in a significant way, not being able to transport their family or get to doctor's appointments and things like that, if they're not fully invested in the climate change changes that we have to make, then we'll lose the momentum. So we have to always be aware of that. Another good example is like the wood burning stove and the backup generators and things like that. When people get cold, that is a challenge. And so, so I just want to make sure that we're thinking about how we take away excuses for doing the right thing with adequate backup solutions that make sure that no one is left behind. And I hope I was articulate about that. This is not my area of expertise, but I do want to make sure, I think the engineer in me wants us to be practical in these conversations and wants us to innovate and to change our habits as we address the climate issues.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, Rep Bynum. Really important to keep in mind. There's another question here about the Workers' Climate Fund. An interesting point that, we just experienced winter weather. I hope you all have been able to stay safe and you've been able to deal with your pipe burstings and other issues and having power. Been a tough week for a lot of folks. And that points out that, the Workers' Climate Fund, as we summarized it, mainly addresses smoke and heat issues. Could that evolve to maybe address unusual extremes on the winter side as well? Don't know if that conversation has come up yet. I think that might be an expansion.
Well, this is Pam. I'll just add a comment. I think one of our challenges for the 2025 session, we're already starting to think about the things that we're not going to be able to do in the short session and putting them on the to-do list for the long session, is institutionalizing in some way that worker protection fund for farm workers. Right now, we're really been dependent on occasional and episodic investments from the general fund that have been administered to help farm workers in cases where they've experienced smoke and hot weather, extreme temperatures. So we need to figure out a way to make that a regular function and not exploitive of opportunities and asks that are made at the moment. And as we put that together, I think there is an opportunity to look more broadly at workers who are affected by weather. The challenge here, frankly, from a strategic point of view, is that it becomes a much more complicated problem. If we're looking at farm workers, we know who that population is. We probably have a pretty good idea of how to identify concerns and how to measure impacts. If we're looking more broadly at workers who are impacted by increasing climate changes, it's a bigger deal. So I suspect the way to start this may be to see if we can simply come up with a really good permanent solution for farm workers, and then over time look at parallel tracks to expand that to other worker populations.
Got it. Thank you, Rep Marsh. I'm going to go really quickly here because we got 2 minutes. Bill, you had a question about buildings. Obviously, as we need to clean up our grid, we also need to improve the efficiency of buildings. Rep Marsh actually co-led a work group all year before last, and then we now have a set of policies as part of the package that Nora spoke to around clean buildings. So we have policies now for new buildings and existing buildings, both residential and commercial, and for state owned buildings, for codes. So a lot of progress there, and you'll see those getting implemented over the next year. Then the last one, and we're happy to talk more about that. Last one is a question. Oh, looks like Rep Bynum addressed that. So perfect. Tegan gave a thumbs up on the answer. Okay, good. It looks like we're covered. I just wanted to, again, thank you all. We've finished on time here. A ton of great information. The slides are available. The recording will be available. And I really appreciate you all as business leaders and colleagues showing up here and arming yourself to participate. Thank you for everyone who said yes, they want to participate in the chat. And this is Nora's email address and my email address. Feel free to keep in touch, and we'll keep you posted on what's going on during session. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your Friday. Take care.